The world had changed overnight, and it was impossible to pinpoint the exact moment it all fell apart. It began as whispers of a virus, a mysterious illness spreading across the globe at an alarming rate. Governments issued warnings, but it was too late. People were already dying, and not just dying, rising again, their bodies transformed into something monstrous. Emily, a young woman in her late 20s, had never considered herself a survivalist. Her life had been simple. She lived in a modest apartment in the city, worked a 9-to-5 office job, and spent weekends hanging out with friends. But all of that was gone now, reduced to a memory. The city, once full of life, was now eerily silent, with buildings standing like broken teeth in a mouth that had long forgotten how to smile. The day it all started, Emily was in her apartment, scrolling through her phone, unaware of the growing chaos outside. She had heard the sirens, seen the flashing lights in the distance, but it wasn't until the news broadcast went silent that the gravity of the situation began to sink in. The world was in the grip of an apocalypse, and it was only a matter of time before it reached her. The first attack came without warning. A neighbor, someone she had waved to in passing, banged on her door, blood dripping from his mouth. His eyes were wide with a crazed hunger, his skin pale and decayed. Before she could react, the door splintered under the force of his fists, and he lunged. Panic surged in her chest, and she barely managed to slam the door shut, the force of the impact shaking her body. She had locked herself in. The sounds of the city burning outside, the distant screams, and the steady thump of her heart echoed in the silence that followed. Emily didn't know where to go, or who to trust. The roads were choked with abandoned cars, and the air reeked of smoke and death. She knew she needed to move, but the thought of leaving the safety of her apartment was terrifying. It wasn't just the zombies, now they were everywhere. The virus spread fast, turning friends and family into killers in a matter of hours. How could she survive in a world that had lost all reason? Days passed as Emily holed up in her apartment, scavenging for food, rationing water, and praying for a miracle. But every day, the reality of the situation hit harder. She was running out of supplies, and the once empty streets were now filled with the groaning, staggering figures of the undead. The walls of her apartment, once a sanctuary, felt more like a prison. One night, as Emily watched the world burn from her window, she saw something that changed everything, a group of survivors, moving quickly down the street, clearly trying to escape from something, or someone. They didn't look like soldiers or police, they looked like ordinary people, people trying to survive. She thought of them as a sign of hope, a glimmer of humanity in a world gone dark. The next morning, Emily made a decision. She had to leave. There was nothing left for her here, and the world outside was becoming even more dangerous by the day. She grabbed her few belongings, took a deep breath, and stepped out into the unknown. This opening part sets up the initial chaos of the apocalypse and introduces the protagonist, Emily. The reader is left with a sense of urgency, as Emily decides to take the first step toward survival. The scene hints at what's to come, struggles for safety, trust, and navigating a world where nothing is familiar anymore. Would you like me to continue with the rest of the outline? The morning sun was weak, struggling to pierce through the haze of smoke that hung over the city like a permanent shroud. Emily took a deep breath, the air thick with the stench of burning debris and death. The world, once bustling and alive, was now eerily quiet, save for the distant groans of the undead and the occasional sound of something scraping across the pavement. She moved cautiously through the streets, staying close to the walls, avoiding open areas where the undead could easily spot her. Her mind raced as she thought about her next steps. She had no real plan, no destination, no idea of where safety might still exist. But she knew one thing: she couldn't stay in the city any longer. The longer she remained in the concrete jungle, the more likely it was that she would become just another casualty of this new world. As she navigated the broken streets, Emily noticed the remnants of civilization, abandoned stores, cars left in the middle of intersections, and the occasional personal item discarded in a hurry. It was as if everyone had tried to escape at once, but the city had consumed them whole. The fear of the unknown gripped her as she passed a storefront, its glass shattered, the shelves inside pillaged, the faint smell of death lingering in the air. The first few hours on the road were quiet, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Her every step was filled with paranoia, every creak and groan from the buildings making her jump. She paused frequently, listening for any sign of movement. The world outside her apartment had changed. Now, every sound could be a threat. Eventually, she came across a group of survivors, 3 men and 2 women, all armed with makeshift weapons, pipes, knives, a broken baseball bat. They looked wary, exhausted, but there was something in their eyes that made Emily pause. It was that same look she'd seen in the mirror countless times over the past few days: fear, uncertainty, and the desperate hope for survival. "Who are you?" one of the men asked, his voice low but firm. Emily hesitated, her mind racing. She had learned the hard way that trust was a luxury she could no longer afford. But in this world, she knew that she couldn't survive alone for much longer. "I'm just trying to find a safe place," she said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. The man studied her for a moment before nodding. "We're headed west. There's a small town about 20 miles from here. They say it's still safe, or at least it was last week." West. The word hung in the air, offering both hope and a new layer of danger. Emily weighed her options. She could go with them, stick together for a while, or continue on her own. But she knew the answer already. She needed people. She needed a chance. "I'll go with you," she said, finally. The group seemed relieved, but there was an unspoken tension between them, something about the way they looked at each other, the way they walked in such tight formation. Emily didn't ask questions. At this point, it was better to stick together than risk going it alone. They continued down the road, avoiding the open highway where the infected seemed to roam in larger numbers. Every now and then, Emily caught a glimpse of a building that had once been a marker of civilization: gas stations, grocery stores, even homes, but now, they were all empty, their windows dark, their doors smashed in. The world she had known was gone. Hours passed, and the group stopped at an overgrown park to rest. They huddled together near a small set of trees, taking turns keeping watch while the others tried to sleep. Emily sat apart from the group, her eyes scanning the horizon. The stillness was unsettling. She hadn't realized how exhausted she was until she allowed herself to sit still, her body aching in ways she hadn't noticed before. One of the women, a tall woman with short black hair and a scar running down her cheek, approached her. "You okay?" she asked softly, sitting beside Emily. "I'm just trying to process all of this," Emily replied. "It's like, the world isn't real anymore." The woman nodded. "It's hard to wrap your head around it. You're not the only one feeling that way. We've all lost something." Emily glanced at the others, their eyes downcast, lost in their own thoughts. The woman's words echoed in her mind, and for the first time since the outbreak, she didn't feel entirely alone. The apocalypse had shattered the world, but it also brought people together in unexpected ways. The day dragged on, and as dusk began to fall, they made their way into a nearby forest. The trees were dense, casting long shadows that seemed to swallow them whole. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was following them, lurking just out of sight. When they reached a small clearing, the group set up a temporary camp. Emily lay awake, listening to the sound of distant groans and the wind rustling through the trees. She closed her eyes, trying to sleep, but all she could think about was the road ahead. It was a road to nowhere. But it was all she had. This second part builds on Emily's journey as she begins to interact with other survivors, moving from her safe zone to the uncertain world outside. There's a mix of suspense and emotional depth, showing her internal conflict and growing dependence on others. Would you like to continue with part 3? The fire crackled in the center of the small camp, sending eerie shadows dancing across the trees. The survivors sat around it in a tense silence, their faces illuminated by the flickering light. Emily could feel the weight of their stares, some curious, others guarded, but she kept her gaze fixed on the fire. It was the only warmth in a world that had turned cold and indifferent. Her mind raced. The journey so far had been an exhausting blur of fear and uncertainty. She was surrounded by strangers, people she didn't know, people she couldn't fully trust, and yet, in this fractured new world, they were her only hope for survival. The woman with the scar, whose name was Sarah, had stayed close by Emily's side since they left the park. They had walked together, exchanged small talk, but there was an unspoken understanding between them. Both of them had seen too much to pretend that the world hadn't changed. Emily wondered about Sarah's past, what kind of life she had lived before the outbreak, but she didn't ask. There were no answers in the past, only in the future. The man with the baseball bat, named Mark, sat a little farther away, sharpening the edge of a crude knife with a stone. His brow furrowed in concentration, but his eyes were always darting around, constantly on alert. Emily had noticed his restlessness during the day. He was the kind of person who didn't trust easily, and that made her nervous. Then there was Jason, the quiet one. He hadn't spoken much since they met, and when he did, his words were often blunt and short. His eyes were heavy with fatigue, his face hollow from days of travel. Emily couldn't tell if he was deep in thought or simply too exhausted to care. Finally, there was Natalie, a teenage girl who had joined the group just a few days earlier. She was sitting off to the side, her knees pulled up to her chest, staring into the fire. Her face looked too young to have already experienced the horrors of this new world. Emily wanted to speak to her, to ask her how she was holding up, but she didn't. The girl hadn't said a word since joining the group, her silence a heavy weight on the already tense atmosphere. "Keep watch," Mark said, breaking the silence. His voice was firm, but there was an underlying edge to it, as if he expected trouble at any moment. "We take turns tonight. Sarah, you're up first." Sarah nodded and stood, stretching her arms before taking up her position near the perimeter of the camp. Emily watched her for a moment, then turned her attention back to the fire. Her thoughts were scattered, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, just beyond the shadows. The hours passed slowly, each minute dragging like an eternity. Emily had never felt time move so slowly before. She was acutely aware of every noise, the rustling of the leaves, the distant howls of the undead, the occasional snap of a twig. She couldn't relax. Not in this world. Not anymore. As the night deepened, Emily's eyes grew heavy. She had barely slept in days, and her body was starting to protest. The fire was dimming, the orange glow flickering as the logs burned down to embers. She fought against the urge to close her eyes, knowing that if she did, she might not wake up in time. Then, a noise. A soft shuffle in the distance. Her heart leapt in her chest, her eyes snapping open. She wasn't the only one who had heard it. The group had stiffened, and Mark immediately stood, motioning for Sarah to join him. The others followed suit, instinctively grabbing their weapons and taking their places around the camp. Emily's pulse raced as she stood, her hand tightening around the handle of a rusty crowbar she had found earlier. Her thoughts raced. Was it an animal? Or was it something much worse, something undead? Mark motioned to the others, signaling them to stay low and quiet. They crept toward the edge of the clearing, their footsteps careful, calculated. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she followed, her senses heightened. She tried to keep her fear in check, but the tension in the air was almost suffocating. Another shuffle. Closer this time. Then, a figure emerged from the shadows. Not one of the undead, but a person, clad in torn clothing, their face hidden behind a mask of grime and dirt. The stranger's eyes were wide, frantic, darting around like an animal caught in a trap. The group froze, weapons raised. "Stay back," the man shouted, his voice hoarse and panicked. "I'm not one of them." Please. Emily could see the desperation in his eyes. He wasn't infected. Not yet. But that didn't mean he was safe. Not in this world. Who are you? Mark demanded, stepping forward, his bat raised. The man shook his head, taking a step back, his hands held up in surrender. I'm just trying to survive, he said, his voice trembling. I got separated from my group. They didn't make it. I'm alone. For a moment, there was silence. The stranger's story rang true, but in a world where trust was a luxury, it was hard to believe anyone. Mark exchanged a glance with Sarah, who was studying the man carefully. Why should we trust you? Mark finally asked, his voice low but dangerous. The stranger opened his mouth to speak, but just as quickly, his eyes widened in horror. Without warning, he turned and bolted into the trees. Damn it! Mark shouted, rushing after him. Emily didn't hesitate. She followed the others, pushing through the underbrush, heart pounding. They couldn't let the man get away. Not with the undead so close. But in the distance, she could hear something else, the unmistakable groans of the infected. They were coming. This part introduces the tension of the night watch, the constant threat of the undead, and a new potential ally, or enemy. The stranger's appearance adds mystery and raises questions about whether they can trust him. The suspense grows as they chase him into the night, with the added danger of the undead closing in. The sound of the undead grew louder as the group chased after the stranger. The shuffling of their feet, the low, guttural groans, echoed through the trees, sending a chill down Emily's spine. Her breath was ragged as she pushed herself harder, the forest around her seeming to close in with each step. Her legs ached, and she could feel the heat of fear rising in her chest. Keep moving. Mark's voice cut through the darkness, urging them on. But Emily wasn't sure if it was the stranger or the infected he was worried about more. They finally broke into a small clearing, and Emily skidded to a halt, her eyes scanning the area for any sign of movement. The stranger had vanished. The group spread out, silently sweeping the area. The groans of the undead were now unmistakable, and Emily could feel the tension in the air. It was only a matter of time before they were surrounded. What now? Sarah asked, her voice tight with frustration. He could be anywhere. We don't have time to search, Mark replied, his voice grim. The undead are close. We need to go, now. Emily's heart raced. The urgency in Mark's voice was palpable. She knew they couldn't afford to waste time chasing someone who might not even be trustworthy. The group needed to stay focused. But there was one question gnawing at her: what was the stranger running from? Was it just the infected, or was there something else hiding in the shadows? Just as they were about to turn back, a voice cut through the stillness. Please, don't leave me. The group froze, turning toward the sound. There, just beyond the edge of the clearing, stood the stranger. His clothes were torn, and his face was pale, but it wasn't the physical exhaustion that made him seem so fragile, it was the look in his eyes. It was the look of someone who had seen too much, someone who had lost everything and had nothing left to lose. Mark's hand tightened around his weapon, ready to strike at any sign of betrayal, but he didn't move forward. He studied the man, his expression unreadable. You're lucky we didn't leave you behind, Mark said, his voice cold. What are you running from? The stranger hesitated, his eyes flicking nervously to the trees, as if expecting something to emerge from the darkness. Then, with a shaky breath, he spoke. My group, my friends, they were attacked by something different. It wasn't like the zombies. Wait, Sarah interrupted, stepping forward. What do you mean, different? The stranger swallowed hard, his throat visibly tightening. It wasn't just the virus. They weren't like the others, these things were smarter. They moved faster, and they attacked differently. They hunted us. They. His voice broke, and for a moment, Emily saw something in the stranger's eyes that chilled her to the bone, pure, unfiltered terror. They took my friends, he whispered. I only escaped because I ran. The silence that followed felt heavy, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The group exchanged uneasy glances, each of them wondering the same thing: what the hell had they just heard? Emily's mind was racing. There were already enough dangers in this new world. Zombies, hunger, the brutal elements, but this? Creatures that hunted humans, that were somehow smarter than the undead? She could barely comprehend it. You're saying there's something else out there, Mark said, his voice steady but laced with suspicion. Something worse than zombies? The stranger nodded, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. I don't know what they are. I don't know if there's anyone else alive who knows, but they aren't like anything I've seen before. They're hunting us. And they're good at it. A cold silence hung in the air as the group processed his words. Emily felt her stomach tighten, the gravity of the situation sinking in. Not only were they trying to survive against the undead, but now they had to worry about something more terrifying, something smarter, something that could track and hunt them like prey. We need to keep moving, Sarah said, breaking the silence, her voice steady but filled with urgency. If what he's saying is true, we're not safe here. Mark nodded, his gaze never leaving the stranger. You stay with us. But don't try anything funny. The stranger didn't argue. His eyes were filled with gratitude and fear, a strange combination that unsettled Emily even more. She had no doubt that they had just learned about something far worse than they could have imagined. As the group moved through the trees, Emily's mind kept turning over the stranger's words. Smarter creatures. Hunted by something else. The weight of it all was almost too much to bear. They had to find safety. And fast. This part introduces a terrifying new element to the world, a more intelligent, predatory threat. The stranger's revelation shifts the focus of their survival, adding a deeper layer of tension and uncertainty. Not only do they have to contend with zombies, but now there's an unknown, more dangerous force stalking them. The group's already fragile trust in each other begins to fray as they consider the implications of this new danger. The night felt longer than it should have, the weight of the stranger's words hanging over them like an oppressive fog. As the group continued their journey through the dense woods, every snap of a twig, every rustle in the leaves, made Emily's heart race. It wasn't just the undead they had to worry about anymore. Now there were creatures, smarter, faster, and far more dangerous than anything they had ever faced. The stranger, whose name, it turned out, was Aaron, had led them deeper into the forest, insisting that they follow a path that would take them to a small cabin he knew of, one that was supposedly off the radar of both zombies and these new predators. His story had been vague, and there was something in his eyes that made Emily question whether he was truly telling them everything. But at this point, they didn't have many options. Every choice they made seemed to lead them down a darker path. We're not far now, Aaron said, his voice barely above a whisper. He glanced over his shoulder, his expression tense. Just a little further. I swear, it's safer there. Mark gave him a sideways glance. It better be, he muttered, his grip on his bat tightening. They pressed on through the woods, the trees closing in around them like silent sentinels. The air was thick with the smell of earth and decay, and the only sounds were their footsteps, muffled by the underbrush, and the occasional distant groan of a zombie. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The forest seemed alive with something more than just the wind, something hunting them. The memory of Aaron's words about the smarter creatures kept replaying in her mind. Suddenly, there was a sharp noise in the distance. A crack of a branch snapping followed by a low growl. Emily froze, her body tensing as she instinctively reached for the crowbar. Her eyes darted around the dark forest, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. Did you hear that? She whispered urgently, her voice tight with fear. Everyone had stopped, their senses on high alert, listening. Another growl, closer this time. "It's them," Aaron muttered, his face drained of color. "They've found us." "Who?" Natalie's voice trembled. She was still too young to fully comprehend the threat, but the fear in her eyes made it clear she knew something was wrong. "Shut up," Mark snapped, cutting her off. "Move." The group began to move again, but this time faster, more urgently. They pushed through the thick underbrush, their breaths coming faster as the growls grew louder. Emily could feel the panic rising in her chest, the adrenaline flooding her system. It wasn't just the undead they were running from now. There was something else, something that was closing in on them, hunting them like prey. The growls intensified, and then, through the trees, Emily saw movement. Shadows darting between the trunks, low to the ground, fast and fluid. Her heart pounded in her chest as her mind struggled to process what she was seeing. They weren't zombies. These things moved with purpose, with intelligence, and they were gaining on them. "They're here," Aaron whispered, his voice trembling with fear. "Run." The group broke into a sprint, tearing through the trees as the growls followed them like a dark chorus. Emily's legs burned with the effort, but there was no time to stop, no time to think. She could hear the others panting, the pounding of their feet on the forest floor, the occasional branch snapping behind them. But all she could focus on was the sound, the growls, getting closer, faster. It felt like something was right behind her, just out of sight, closing in with every second. A scream cut through the night air. It was Jason. Emily whipped around, her heart stopping in her chest. Jason was on the ground, one of the creatures on top of him, its long claws digging into his flesh. The thing was unlike any zombie she had ever seen. Its skin was mottled, like a patchwork of rotting flesh, and its eyes that burned with an unnatural intelligence, locked onto hers with a predatory gaze. The others stopped, horror etched on their faces. Mark lunged forward, swinging his bat with all his might, smashing it across the creature's back. It hissed, but didn't let go of Jason, who was now struggling desperately to free himself. "Help him!" Sarah screamed, her voice cracking. Without thinking, Emily ran toward them, adrenaline pushing her forward. She swung the crowbar at the creature, aiming for its head, but it twisted, dodging with unnerving speed. The thing hissed, its long, sharp teeth snapping at the air as it turned to face her, its eyes glowing with malice. "Emily, get back!" Mark shouted, but it was too late. The creature lunged at her, its claws raking across her arm. Pain exploded in her shoulder, and she cried out, stumbling backward. Blood trickled down her arm as the thing screeched, preparing to strike again. But before it could reach her, Sarah was on it. She swung a makeshift knife with terrifying precision, plunging it into the creature's side. It screeched in pain, the sound filling the forest as it collapsed to the ground, its body twitching before it went still. Jason's body lay motionless, his blood pooling beneath him, a horrific testament to the speed and ferocity of the predator. The group gathered around him, their faces grim as they realized what had just happened. He was gone. Emily's heart pounded as she knelt beside him, her mind reeling from the violence of the attack. They hadn't just been running from the undead, they had been running from something far worse. Something far more intelligent. "We need to move," Mark said, his voice cold and controlled despite the terror in his eyes. "Now." With heavy hearts and the weight of Jason's death hanging over them, the group continued their journey. But now, the forest felt even darker. The creatures were hunting them, and no place would be safe. This part intensifies the stakes as the group encounters the smarter predators, leading to a tragic loss. The attack on Jason exposes the terrifying speed and ferocity of these creatures and shifts the group's focus from just surviving the zombies to avoiding these more deadly threats. Emily's arm injury also adds another layer of vulnerability. The air was thick with dread as the group stumbled forward, leaving Jason's body behind. The loss was like a weight on their hearts, crushing any semblance of hope that had once lingered. Every step forward felt like they were walking deeper into a nightmare. The forest, once a sanctuary, now felt like a trap, a dark labyrinth that offered no way out. Emily's shoulder throbbed with pain from the creature's claws, but she forced herself to push through it. The blood soaked her sleeve, but there was no time to stop. The others moved in a dazed silence, their faces haunted by the loss of one of their own. Jason had been their friend, a part of their fragile family in this new world, and now he was gone, taken by something they didn't fully understand. "We have to keep moving," Mark said, his voice distant and cold, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. "We can't let them catch us." His words were mechanical, as if he were trying to shut off the part of him that was grieving. But even he couldn't hide the raw pain in his eyes. It was clear that Jason's death had rattled him more than he cared to admit. But there was no room for weakness, not now. The group walked in tight formation, trying to remain as quiet as possible, though it felt impossible to escape the tension that weighed on their shoulders. The forest seemed to stretch on endlessly, the trees closing in around them, their twisted branches resembling skeletal hands that reached out to trap them. Emily's thoughts were a whirlwind. She kept replaying the moments of the attack in her mind, the creature's glowing eyes, its terrifying speed, and the way it had torn into Jason so effortlessly. She had seen death before, but this was different. The predators weren't just killing for survival, they were hunting for sport. And now, they were hunting her, hunting all of them. A sudden noise broke the silence, a rustling in the underbrush, followed by a low growl. Emily's heart skipped a beat. She stopped, her breath catching in her throat. Mark, sensing her hesitation, held up a hand to stop the group. They all froze, listening intently. The growl came again, louder this time, closer. Something was out there, tracking them, and it wasn't the slow, shuffling steps of a zombie. "They're here," Mark muttered, his voice barely audible. The group quickly fell into action, moving off the main path and ducking behind a cluster of large rocks, hoping to hide. Emily's breath was ragged as she pressed herself into the shadows, her eyes darting between the trees, searching for any sign of movement. The growl was growing louder, and she could hear the rustling of leaves as something, or someone, moved through the underbrush. "Don't make a sound," Mark whispered urgently. Emily could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. Every muscle in her body was coiled, ready to spring into action, but she didn't know if they would be fast enough. If they were spotted, there would be no escape. The creatures had already proven they were faster, smarter, and more ruthless than anything they had ever encountered. The growls grew louder, and then, as if on cue, the creatures emerged from the trees, 3 of them, their eyes glowing in the dim light. Their movements were fluid, predatory, as they scanned the area, noses twitching as they sniffed the air. Emily's breath hitched as one of them looked directly in her direction, its yellow eyes locking onto hers for a split second. It paused, tilting its head as if it were considering her. And then, without warning, it started moving toward her. Panic surged through Emily as she grabbed for her crowbar. Her fingers fumbled, and she could feel her heart pounding in her throat. The creature was almost upon them. But Mark was quicker. Without a word, Mark surged forward, swinging his bat with all his strength. The blow connected with the creature's head, knocking it off course. The creature hissed in pain, its claws swiping at the air as it backed away, snarling. "Run!" Mark yelled. The group didn't need any further encouragement. They bolted, scattering in different directions, desperate to avoid becoming the creature's next meal. Emily's legs burned as she pushed herself harder, her injured shoulder screaming in protest, but she didn't dare stop. The growls followed them, relentless, like shadows that never let up. She could hear the others nearby, but there was no time to check if they were still with her. All that mattered was putting distance between themselves and the creatures. Suddenly, the ground gave way beneath her. Emily yelped as she tumbled forward, her body crashing into the ground. Pain exploded in her knee, but she quickly pushed herself to her feet, ignoring the agony. Her mind was focused on one thing: survival. Her eyes scanned the area frantically. She needed to find cover, but the forest felt like an endless stretch of nothingness. There was nowhere to hide. And then, through the trees, she saw it, a small cabin, tucked away in the shadows, just barely visible through the dense foliage. "Over there," she shouted, her voice cracking with urgency. The others heard her and followed her lead, moving toward the cabin as quickly as they could. The creatures were still in pursuit, but they were losing ground. The cabin was their only chance at survival. As they reached the door, Mark shoved it open, and the group scrambled inside. The wooden walls creaked under the pressure, and Emily slammed the door shut, pressing her back against it. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she listened for any sign of movement outside. The cabin was small and dimly lit, with a fireplace at one end and a single table in the center. It was a temporary refuge, but it would have to do. They were safe, for now. But the question that lingered in Emily's mind was the same one that had been haunting her since they encountered the creatures: how long would they stay safe? And, more importantly, who else would they lose before they finally found the safety they were so desperately searching for? This part focuses on the immediate danger of the creatures as they hunt the group through the forest, leading to a desperate sprint for survival. The brief moment of hope offered by the cabin provides a temporary respite, but the tension remains high. The creature's intelligence and hunting abilities add a constant layer of fear, and the group's vulnerability becomes more evident. The small cabin was cold, and the air inside seemed stale, untouched by time. Emily leaned against the door, her breathing coming in sharp, shallow gasps as she tried to calm her racing heart. Her eyes scanned the room, but there was little to see, just old wooden floors, a dusty fireplace, and a table with scattered remnants of what appeared to be long-abandoned survival supplies. A single oil lamp flickered weakly in the corner, casting long, trembling shadows across the room. The others were already gathered by the table, still catching their breath. Their faces were drawn, their expressions haunted by the close call they had just experienced. Mark, despite his usual bravado, looked defeated, his shoulders slumped under the weight of his grief and the responsibility of leading the group. His eyes met Emily's, and for a moment, she saw the brokenness in them, the same fear that gripped her heart. "We're safe, for now," he said quietly, his voice distant. "But it won't be long before they find us again." Emily nodded, her thoughts racing. The creatures had been relentless in their pursuit, and now, locked inside this cabin, she couldn't help but feel the suffocating weight of their isolation. The world outside had become a nightmare, a place where survival was no longer guaranteed. They weren't just running from zombies anymore, they were running from something far worse. "What are we going to do?" Sarah's voice was shaky, her eyes wide with fear. She was sitting on the floor, hugging her knees to her chest as she stared at the others. Mark ran a hand through his hair, his expression tense. "We can't stay here long. It's too dangerous. We need to find a more permanent shelter, somewhere they won't be able to track us. But I don't know where that is yet." Aaron, who had been standing by the window, turned toward them, his face pale. "There's a place, not far from here. I've heard rumors about it. A compound, fortified, built before the outbreak. But we'd have to get there quickly. It's our best shot." Emily looked at Aaron, unsure of what to make of him. He'd been a stranger when they first met, and now he was offering them hope, something they hadn't had in days. But there was something unsettling about the way he spoke, like he knew too much. "A compound?" Mark raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "How do we even know it's real? What if it's just another trap?" Aaron's gaze hardened. "I'm not saying it's a guaranteed safe haven, but it's better than this place. And it's our only option if we want to survive." Silence fell over the group, the weight of the decision hanging heavily in the air. Emily could see the uncertainty in everyone's eyes, the fear of the unknown, and the exhaustion from the constant struggle to stay alive. They were running out of time, out of options. "All right," Mark said, his voice steady despite the doubt that lingered in his eyes. "We leave at dawn. But we stick together, no matter what." The group nodded in agreement, though no one looked entirely convinced. They had survived so far by sheer luck, but luck wasn't something they could rely on forever. As the night wore on, the shadows in the cabin seemed to grow darker, more oppressive. The sound of the wind outside howling against the walls only added to the sense of isolation. Emily couldn't sleep. The pain in her shoulder kept her awake, but it was more than that. Her mind kept replaying everything that had happened, the creatures, Jason's death, the haunting look in Aaron's eyes. What if the compound was a lie? What if it was just another cruel illusion, another broken promise in a world that had lost all semblance of normalcy? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps, soft, deliberate. Emily turned, her heart skipping a beat as she saw Aaron standing in the doorway, his silhouette barely visible in the dim light. "You're awake," he said, his voice low and cautious. Emily nodded, trying to hide the wariness in her expression. "I couldn't sleep. The pain, it's bad." Aaron stepped into the room, moving closer to her. "You've been through a lot," he said, his voice tinged with something almost sympathetic. "You're stronger than you know." Emily frowned, not sure what to make of his words. "Why are you really helping us, Aaron?" she asked, her voice steady despite the suspicion gnawing at her. "I don't trust you. And I don't think I'm the only one." Aaron paused, his eyes flicking toward the others, who were still resting, unaware of the conversation unfolding. He sighed and stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I know what it's like to lose everything," he said, his tone darker now. "I've seen things, been places worse than this. But I'm not lying about the compound. It's real. It's the only chance we have left." Emily studied his face, searching for any hint of deceit. She had learned to trust her instincts, and right now, her instincts were telling her that Aaron was hiding something. But what choice did they have? "Okay," she said finally, her voice quiet. "We'll follow you. But if this turns out to be a lie..." "It won't," Aaron interrupted, his expression hardening. "I'll get you there. You have my word." Emily wasn't sure if she believed him, but she didn't have the luxury of doubt. The road ahead was dangerous, and they needed to take risks if they were going to survive. She nodded slowly, then turned to look out the window. The night was still, but the forest outside felt alive with the threat of what was to come. The creatures were still out there, waiting. And so were the zombies, the endless horde that had ravaged the world they once knew. But somewhere out there, beyond the shadows, was a place of hope, a place where they might find safety. Or maybe, just maybe, it was another road to nowhere. This part dives into the group's growing distrust and the difficult choices they face. Aaron's motivations are questioned, and the uncertainty of the compound's existence adds to the tension. Emily's struggle with her injuries and the weight of the decisions ahead makes for a reflective moment, showing her growing wariness of the unknown. The dawn arrived too soon, the first light of the sun casting a pale glow across the cabin's worn wooden floor. Emily could hear the others stirring, slowly awakening from their restless sleep. The quiet hum of the morning felt surreal after the chaos of the night before. There was no sound of creatures or zombies nearby, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She could still hear the low, distant growls from the forest, a reminder that danger was never far away. Mark was the first to rise, his movements deliberate and stiff. He was already packing his small bag, preparing for the journey ahead. His face was set in a grim expression, the weight of the decision they had made the night before heavy on his shoulders. "You ready?" he asked Emily, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep. Emily nodded, forcing a small smile. "As ready as I'll ever be." They gathered their belongings, checking their supplies one last time. The last of their food was nearly gone, and their water supply was running low. There was no telling how far they would have to travel to reach the compound Aaron spoke of, or what other dangers they might encounter along the way. But there was no other choice. They couldn't stay in the cabin forever. Aaron was already by the door, his face hard and unreadable. He had barely spoken since their conversation the night before, and Emily couldn't help but wonder what was going on in his mind. Was he truly leading them to safety, or was he just using them as a means to an end? "Let's go," Aaron said, his voice low, eyes flicking briefly toward Emily before he turned to lead the way out of the cabin. The group followed him in silence, the door creaking shut behind them as they stepped back into the cold morning air. The forest around them was still, eerily quiet. The trees stood tall like silent sentinels, watching as they made their way through the underbrush. Emily's shoulder ached with every step, but she pushed the pain aside. Her focus was sharp now. They needed to move quickly, to stay ahead of whatever was out there. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves sent her heart racing, but she couldn't afford to be paralyzed by fear. Not now. As they moved deeper into the forest, the sounds of the outside world seemed to fade away. The only sounds that remained were their footsteps, the occasional snap of a twig, and the distant call of birds, sounds that felt almost too normal for a world so broken. It didn't take long before the first sign of trouble emerged. A low growl echoed from the trees, sending a chill down Emily's spine. She froze, her body tensing instinctively. The others stopped as well, looking around in confusion. "What was that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Aaron didn't answer immediately. His eyes narrowed, scanning the trees with sharp, practiced intensity. "Stay close," he muttered, reaching for the rifle slung over his shoulder. Emily's pulse quickened. The sound had come from the direction they were heading. She felt a knot form in her stomach. Had the creatures found them? Or were the zombies closing in? Before she could voice her concerns, a shadow darted through the trees, and then another, and another. Emily's breath caught in her throat as the figures materialized from the underbrush. They weren't the mindless, slow-moving zombies she was used to. These were different, faster, more agile, with a predatory grace that made her blood run cold. "We need to move. Now!" Mark barked, pulling at Emily's arm. Aaron stepped forward, raising his rifle, and fired off 2 quick shots. The creatures hissed, retreating into the trees with alarming speed. Emily's heart raced. They had barely escaped that encounter, and it was clear that these things were not like the zombies they had come to fear, they were something much worse. "We're getting close," Aaron said, his voice tight. "Stay focused." The group pressed on, moving with more urgency now, their pace quickening as they headed toward the rumored compound. The forest seemed to close in on them, the trees growing thicker as they made their way deeper into the wilderness. Every step felt like they were venturing into a darker, more dangerous world. And then, as if on cue, the landscape began to change. The trees started to thin, giving way to open fields, the earth uneven and scarred from years of neglect. In the distance, Emily could see the faint outline of a large structure, its silhouette stark against the gray sky. It was a compound, a fortress, just as Aaron had promised. The tall, metal gates were rusted, but still intact. The walls around it were high, and there were signs of old, makeshift barricades, evidence of a place that had once been prepared for something like this. But as they approached, the air shifted. The closer they got to the compound, the more unsettled Emily felt. There was something off about the place, something wrong. Aaron's pace slowed as he approached the gate. "This is it," he said, almost reverently. The others came to a halt behind him, their eyes scanning the compound. It looked abandoned. The gates were locked, the area around it was silent, and there were no signs of movement. "I don't like this," Mark said, his voice low. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. It felt like a trap, an illusion of safety. They had fought so hard to get here, but now that they were standing in front of it, the weight of their choices pressed heavily on her. "Let's get inside," Aaron said, his voice insistent. "It's our only chance." As the group stood at the gates, Emily's mind raced. They had come so far, but was this truly the end of their journey, or just the beginning of a new nightmare? With a deep breath, she stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. And then, the sound that would haunt her for the rest of her life filled the air, a loud, echoing bang from within the compound, followed by the unmistakable sound of a metal door opening. A figure emerged from the shadows. It was too late to turn back. This final part leaves the group standing at the edge of what they hope is safety, but the ominous presence of the compound and the figure emerging from it suggests that their survival might be just as fragile as ever. The final choice, to enter or turn away, is left in limbo, maintaining the suspense of the story. Would you like any edits or to develop another part of the story?